HOA. That three-letter acronym made my blood boil the moment I saw their newest stunt. At exactly 7:15 a.m. last Tuesday, I stepped onto my porch, expecting a calm breeze across my ranch yard. Instead, my eyes locked onto a large "no entrance" sign that looked like it had been hammered straight into the ground by someone with an overly enthusiastic sense of authority. If you're wondering who decided to place that giant warning on my private land, well, I'm pointing my finger directly at the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. This wasn't some innocent mistake or a politely worded notice. It was an outright blockade. The sign was enormous, so bright red it nearly glowed in the morning sun, and it was screaming the message, "Keep out or face consequences." My ranch yard, where I'd lived peacefully for over a decade, was suddenly off limits by someone else's command. I stared for a good minute, coffee mug trembling in my hand. That sign threatened more than just my pride. It threatened the sense of belonging I'd nurtured here for years. You see, behind that sign was a carefully orchestrated plan by the HOA president, a woman named Valerie Holmes, someone who had twisted her position into a personal kingdom. But I wasn't the kind to bow down easily. As that vile piece of plastic flapped in the morning wind, I made a promise under my breath. I'd find a way to stand my ground, no matter how far this power trip went. I couldn't forget the day Valerie Holmes first strutted into Willow Creek's annual meeting. She wore a sleek, charcoal gray suit that looked 2 sizes too big, as if she had borrowed it from someone else to appear more authoritative. Back then, I thought she was just ambitious, but not necessarily harmful. Little did I know how quickly she'd morph into an authoritarian figure with an insatiable need for control. The no entrance sign was merely a symptom of her deeper obsession with dictating how people lived. Within weeks of her election, we'd been bombarded with notices about mailbox colors, gutter cleaning frequencies, and the correct shade of beige for our fences. It felt surreal. Grown adults were being patronized as if we were kids in need of constant supervision. Each new rule arrived on official stationery that smelled of cheap perfume, and across the top was printed, "Because order keeps a community strong." More like, "Because intimidation keeps Valerie in power," if you asked me. The night I first read one of those memos, I recall shaking my head in disbelief. My wife asked if the letters were a joke, but no matter how absurd these mandates were, Valerie always found a way to cite some regulation number, which half the time seemed invented out of thin air. Although it annoyed me, I mostly shrugged it off until that Tuesday morning. The line had been crossed. My driveway was my property, and so was the yard behind the stables. Now, the HOA had declared it a restricted zone. Something smelled rotten, and it wasn't just the soggy mulch I'd piled up last week. With the sign glaring at me like some giant exclamation point, I resolved to confront Valerie. But not before I did my homework. I poured a second cup of coffee and rummaged through my old filing cabinet to find the property deed, boundary maps, and all the official documents that confirmed my rightful ownership of that entire stretch of land. My father had insisted on thorough record-keeping ever since he bought the initial acreage. He used to say, "A man who holds every paper close holds his rights even closer." I never understood the depth of that statement until I found myself under siege by these HOA tactics. As I flipped through folders labeled with dusty dates, I couldn't help but remember my grandfather's advice. Follow the paper trail, son, because somewhere you'll find the truth. Looking back, I believe he was referring to his own run-ins with unscrupulous city officials decades ago, an era when backroom deals were often scribbled on napkins at local diners. We lived in a world that pretended to be transparent, but as long as folks like Valerie existed, there'd be hidden agendas lurking in the background. I clasped a thick envelope containing survey results that proved that big no entrance sign was planted well within my property lines, not a communal road or shared space. I wanted to speak with her rationally. Maybe this was a misunderstanding, but given her track record, I had a hunch she was pushing boundaries on purpose. If confrontation was the only way, so be it. My next step: march to the HOA office, which ironically sat in a small building financed in part by our mandatory homeowner dues. When I arrived at the HOA office, a short drive from my ranch, a single fluorescent light flickered overhead in the cramped lobby. I could smell the faint aroma of cheap disinfectant. It reminded me of a dentist's waiting room. Valerie was standing behind a desk cluttered with papers and a laptop angled to hide her screen from prying eyes. She glanced up, and I caught a glimpse of that smug half-smile. "Good morning," she said, arching an eyebrow. "What can I do for you?" Her tone dripped condescension. "I'm here about that sign," I replied, gripping the folder of documents. "You blocked off my ranch yard with a large, no entrance notice. Care to explain?" She pursed her lips, her gaze flicking to the folder in my hands. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, using my last name with a theatrical sigh, "this is a necessary measure to preserve the community aesthetic and safety. Your yard, frankly, has become a thoroughfare, and we can't allow that." The nerve of this woman. She was insinuating that my yard was a hazard. Sure, some folks took shortcuts now and then, but I'd never complained. If anything, it was neighborly. "I have documents," I said calmly, "proving that land is private property. It's not under the HOA's jurisdiction." Valerie clicked her tongue. "Our lawyer found a clause in the original development guidelines granting the association oversight of all major points of ingress and egress within Willow Creek." She said it as though reciting lines from a script. I nearly laughed. Was she expecting me to swallow that generic explanation? I set my folder on the desk. "Take a look," I said. "Boundary lines, official county records, all authorized. That sign you put up is on my property, Valerie." At the mention of her first name, her expression darkened. "This matter is closed," she snapped. "If you want to dispute it, I suggest you contact the board in writing." She turned on her heel and walked to a back room, leaving me standing there with a slow-burning anger. I realized any polite approach was wasted on her. That sign was no mere accident. It was a deliberate intrusion, and I had better prepare for a bigger battle. Driving home, I couldn't stop replaying our exchange in my head. Every condescending tilt of her chin made me clench my jaw. I'd dealt with petty bureaucrats before, but none with such a flair for self-righteous tyranny. This standoff was personal now. I parked by my porch, stared at the sign again, and wondered how far Valerie would go. My neighbor, Steve Mason, waved at me from across the street. His expression told me he'd witnessed something unusual too. Steve strolled over, scratching the back of his head. "You see that monstrosity?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward the sign. "Yeah, and I just had a lovely conversation with Valerie about it," I replied, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. Steve nodded slowly. "She sent me a notice last week, demanding that I replace my wooden fence because the color isn't HOA approved. Man, we have farmland out here. It's normal for wood to look like wood." We both chuckled, though neither of us found it genuinely funny. It was more a shared exasperation. "Let me guess. She threatened a fine?" I asked. $300, Steve said, "if I don't paint it beige." I rubbed my temples. "Our fences are older than that woman's entire tenure in Willow Creek, and she's acting like they can be swapped out on a whim." Steve spat on the ground, frustration evident. We knew we had to stick together. "I have something in mind," I confessed, glancing at my yard. "A way to show the HOA they can't just bully us." Steve grinned, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Count me in, Fletcher. I've had enough of her nonsense." With that, we parted ways, and I returned inside to sift through more documents, determined to find any legal basis for my next move. Later that evening, I spent hours hunched over old blueprints for the ranch. My father had been meticulous, and so had my grandfather. Tucked deep in the file were notes about the original boundaries. I noticed a slight discrepancy in the lines near the back road that cut along the fence line behind my property. The HOA's official map didn't match the earliest county survey. That discrepancy, only a few feet, might be exactly what I needed. According to some margin notes penned by my grandfather, that sliver of land had been omitted from the official HOA annexation years ago. He apparently foresaw trouble, writing, "Keep an eye on this. They might try to claim more land than they own." At the time, it must have seemed paranoid, but now, I was grateful for his caution. Every note felt like a puzzle piece, each discovery fueling my determination. The thought that Valerie might have fabricated or twisted regulations only added to my motivation. If she was playing dirty, I'd be ready. I scratched my chin, pondering how best to use this knowledge. I decided that if the HOA was bold enough to block my entrance, I would build my own fence on that borderline and legally cut off what they claimed was an important pathway. Of course, I'd have to verify whether the local building codes allowed such a structure, but the idea flickered in my mind like a fresh spark. They wanted to paint me as the villain? Fine, I'd become the villain with a strong legal foundation. If Valerie wanted to wage a war of signs and fences, I'd meet her on that battlefield. Early the next morning, I dialed the county assessor's office. While waiting on hold, a repetitive jingle played through the phone, the kind that grates on your nerves after 15 seconds. Finally, an official-sounding voice greeted me. I explained the boundary lines, referencing my grandfather's documents. The clerk agreed to send me official copies of the survey from decades ago. That took some time, but eventually, I got digital scans emailed over. Sure enough, it confirmed that small corridor behind my property exactly where I planned to place a fence did not, in any form, belong to the HOA. It was well within my rights to build there. I spent the next several hours drafting a simple fence design, measuring distances so it wouldn't violate local height ordinances. The plan was straightforward, but its symbolism was huge. By erecting a fence in that narrow strip, I could effectively prevent the HOA from using the private road they'd come to rely on as a secondary route. They wouldn't be able to access that part of the neighborhood without taking a significantly longer detour. It might sound petty, but it was a direct countermeasure to them interfering with my property. Turnabout is fair play, my father used to say, and if Valerie insisted on crossing me, she'd have to deal with the consequences. That evening, I talked it over with Steve. He nearly burst out laughing at the brilliance of it. "This is so simple, but so effective," he said, slapping my shoulder. "Let me know when you start building. I'll lend a hand." There was a hint of mischief in his voice. We both found it satisfying to imagine Valerie's face when she discovered a brand new fence blocking her cherished shortcut. The following day, I called a local contractor who specialized in small-scale fence installations. His name was Arturo, an affable guy who had a talent for efficient work. When I mentioned my plan, he chuckled. "I've been hearing all sorts of HOA horror stories lately," he said. "Folks are tired of these boards overstepping their authority." We agreed on a start date for the project, the coming Saturday. Before I hung up, he added, "By the way, if you get any pushback from that association, just let me know. We keep records of every permit we pull." I thanked him, feeling reassured. However, as I was finalizing details, a black SUV pulled up in front of my house, and out stepped Valerie, wearing sunglasses that covered half her face. She marched toward my porch without knocking, pushing the gate to the side with a huff. I ended the call and turned to face her. "Good afternoon, Valerie," I said, forcing politeness. She lifted the corner of her mouth in a tight smile, but it lacked any warmth. "I've received word," she began, emphasizing each syllable, "that you are attempting to construct some sort of fence. I'm here to inform you that any modifications must receive written approval from the HOA board." She almost sounded triumphant, as if she believed she'd caught me red-handed. I took a step forward, the folder of surveys in my hand. "Actually," I said, flipping to the relevant page, "I've confirmed with the county that this section of land is mine, free and clear. Your board's permission is not required." She shot me a withering look. "Everything in Willow Creek is under the board's oversight," she insisted, lowering her sunglasses slightly to glare at the documents. "We have a legal team, and I'll be sure to bring this matter before them." I clenched my jaw, trying not to lose my temper. "So be it," I answered. "But you'll find that the law is on my side." Without replying, she spun on her heel, slammed the gate shut behind her, and disappeared into the SUV, tires screeching on the asphalt. I stood there, heart pounding. I realized this was only a preview of the confrontation to come. That night, I found myself wide awake, replaying every confrontation in my mind. As the clock showed 2:10 a.m., I stared at the ceiling, thinking about my late grandfather. He had once cautioned me, "Some fights are worth having, even if they stir up a hornet's nest. There's no substitute for standing your ground." I never pictured myself tangling with an HOA, but the principle was the same. Someone was overstepping, challenging the rightful ownership of my land. Drifting in and out of restless dreams, I saw images of bright red signs, stacked paperwork, and Valerie's sneering face. By dawn, I had decided no intimidation tactic would deter me. Saturday morning arrived with crisp sunshine and a gentle breeze. Arturo showed up with his team, along with a truck filled with lumber and supplies. Steve joined us a little later, carrying a thermos of coffee and enough breakfast burritos to feed an army. We got straight to work. With every hammer blow echoing across the yard, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Each post we placed was like a statement. This land wasn't up for grabs by the HOA. Passersby slowed their cars, curiosity evident on their faces. Some waved, a few shouted words of encouragement. It was impossible to miss the significance of that fence. It ran parallel to the road, effectively separating what had been a convenient cut-through for certain HOA members. The no entrance sign still loomed in my own yard, but we'd overshadow it with a fence that said, "Private, keep out legally." Halfway through construction, I heard Valerie's SUV again. She parked on the far side of the street, stepping out in a stiff blazer. This time, she was not alone. A man in a crisp black suit trailed behind her, possibly one of her so-called legal advisors. They stood at a distance, watching. I refused to give them any satisfaction by acknowledging their presence. Instead, I focused on ensuring the fence posts were level and secure. Valerie occasionally pointed in our direction, likely spouting threats about violations, but they didn't approach. After about 20 minutes, they left, tires squealing once more. The whole scene reminded me of vultures circling, waiting for an opportunity to swoop in. By late afternoon, the fence was nearly complete, a sturdy structure about 4 feet high, well within local regulations. Arturo nodded approvingly. "Looks good, boss," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Don't forget to keep your permits on hand. If that HOA tries anything, you show 'em you followed the rules." I expressed my gratitude to him and his team, settling the payment and ensuring they had all the documentation. Steve hung around as the sun dipped lower, golden rays stretching across the fresh wood. We both admired the fence for a moment. "You know," Steve said quietly, "this is a stand for the entire neighborhood, not just you." I nodded. "That's what I'm hoping. Maybe others will see they don't have to cave in." He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "I'll see you tomorrow, buddy." As he walked away, I took a moment to consider how this simple fence had come to represent our collective pushback against an overbearing authority. The next day, I woke to a pounding on my door at 8 a.m. It was a Sunday. How polite of them to disturb me first thing. I opened to find Valerie, flanked by 2 board members I recognized from last year's annual meeting. They had clipboards and wore identical expressions of annoyance. Before I could say a word, Valerie launched into a tirade. "We're issuing you an official warning," she said, brandishing a sheet of paper. "You have violated multiple HOA regulations by constructing this fence without board approval. We demand its removal within 72 hours, or you'll be fined." Her voice carried a steely edge. I glanced at the other 2, who avoided eye contact. "I followed local laws," I countered. "This is my property, beyond the HOA's domain." One of the members started to speak, but Valerie cut him off with a raised hand. She nearly hissed as she declared, "The board makes the rules here. If you refuse to comply, we'll see you in court. And trust me, our legal budget is extensive." I felt my pulse spike, but instead of yelling, I stayed calm. "I have every document proving my right to build that fence. You're welcome to waste your organization's money on a lawsuit." Valerie's eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing further. She shoved the warning notice at me, turned, and marched back to her car with her entourage trailing behind. By midweek, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip about my fence. Some folks congratulated me on standing up to the HOA. Others worried about repercussions. I heard rumors that Valerie was quietly pressuring individuals behind the scenes, telling them they'd be next if they supported my cause. The intimidation tactics reminded me of old stories where local tyrants would bully residents into submission, but we were living in modern times. People had cameras, phones, and the internet to spread information. Valerie couldn't operate in darkness for long. As I mulled over the next steps, I recalled an offhand remark my grandfather had once made. "When the cunning want to hide a bigger scheme, they'll pick a small fight to distract you." The words rang in my ears like an echo. Could there be something bigger at play? Was the no entrance sign just a ploy to divert attention from a more significant land grab or some hidden agreement? Valerie's confidence suggested she might have backing from someone with influence, perhaps a local developer, or maybe an official who stood to benefit from expansions or rezoning. Curiosity gnawed at me. I decided to dig deeper. That evening, I combed through Willow Creek's archived records at the local library, hoping to find anything suspicious like rezoning applications, newly filed deeds, or unusual construction permits. It was tedious work, but about an hour into it, I stumbled across a mention of a proposed commercial development in an adjacent area. The developer's name was listed as Brookhawk Investments. If that project went through, it would require improved access roads. Lo and behold, the prime route for that future access lay dangerously close to the disputed portion behind my property. Could it be that the HOA was getting a kickback from the developer for ensuring the land was cleared of any ownership disputes? The more I read, the more everything started to fit together. Valerie's aggression, the sudden push to control my backyard, and the unwavering confidence that the HOA would triumph. This wasn't just about petty power plays. It hinted at potential corruption. The next day, I discreetly shared my findings with Steve. We sat on his porch, sipping lemonade. "So you're telling me," he said, leaning in, "that they might be trying to claim your land so a developer can run a road through it?" I nodded. "It's speculation at this point, but the puzzle pieces line up. The developer needs an access route. The HOA apparently wants to help pave the way, and I'm in their path." Steve let out a low whistle. "That's a bigger fight than just a fence. If there's underhanded money involved, they'll stop at nothing to steamroll you." I rubbed the back of my neck, the tension mounting. "I'll need concrete proof," I said. "Half-baked suspicions won't hold up if they drag me to court. I plan to gather every morsel of evidence, so when the time comes I can expose them." That night, I found it nearly impossible to sleep, my curiosity twisted into concern. If the HOA was indeed colluding with a developer, Valerie's intimidation made perfect sense. The board's legal budget might not just be from our dues, it could be supplemented by corporate interests. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. Fight smarter, not just harder. The next morning, I made a decision. I would contact a friend who happened to be a retired county official, someone who knew the ins and outs of local politics. His name was Donovan Price, a man well-versed in spotting shady deals. Over the phone, I explained my predicament. Donovan paused, cleared his throat, and finally said, "Fletcher, you might be onto something. I heard rumors about expansions near Willow Creek. Let me do some digging on my end." Within a few days, Donovan got back to me, voice tinged with urgency. "I can't confirm everything yet, but it looks like there's been an unusual spike in meetings between the HOA leadership and Brookhawk Investments. No official minutes are posted though, which is suspicious. Keep your eyes open." Armed with this insider tip, I felt my resolve harden. Valerie's no-entrance sign wasn't just an arbitrary show of power. It was a step toward forcibly reclassifying my backyard as communal or borderline land. If she succeeded, her developer allies would have an easier path to push a new road through the neighborhood. That revelation turned this from a neighborhood squabble into a moral imperative. My ranch yard, passed down through generations of my family, wasn't going to be sold off in some shady deal. I'd fight it tooth and nail. The final push came when I received a legal notice from the HOA's attorneys, giving me an ultimatum. Tear down my newly built fence within 5 days or face a lawsuit. The letter threatened damages, court costs, and additional fines. But, reading it closely, I saw it was riddled with ambiguous language, referencing unified land usage and community road expansions. They were practically telegraphing their real intentions. They wanted that area free and clear, presumably to align with developer specs. Rather than panic, I smiled grimly. Their heavy-handed approach was about to backfire. I consulted a lawyer recommended by Donovan. Her name was Barbara Monroe, a sharp litigator with a formidable reputation. She reviewed my evidence, from the original boundary surveys to the snippet about the commercial development. "I see what's happening," she said, tapping a pen against the table. "They're bluffing, hoping you'll cave before they have to disclose the bigger plan. Let them sue. We'll file a counterclaim that forces them to produce all relevant documents, including any communication with Brookhawk." I felt relief wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I sensed we had a real strategy. Sure, a lawsuit was never pleasant, but if it compelled the HOA to reveal their hidden dealings, it might unravel their entire scheme. Barbara also suggested we document everything: photographs of the fence, the sign, witness statements, and any letters from the HOA. Steve agreed to provide a sworn affidavit detailing the intimidation tactics. We also quietly reached out to two other neighbors who had faced suspicious fines and threats, suspecting they too were in the path of future expansions. All of them were more than willing to speak up, having grown weary of Valerie's overreach. The storm was about to break. 2 weeks later, in a stuffy conference room at the county courthouse, we met for a preliminary mediation. Valerie arrived with her attorney, a pompous man in a glossy suit who introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell. We sat at a long table. On my side were Barbara, Donovan as an advisor, and Steve as a witness. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, called the meeting to order. Valerie's attorney started off strong, parroting the standard lines about community well-being and HOA rights. He insisted the fence was an unlawful obstruction, citing nebulous regulations. Barbara let him finish, then calmly presented our side. She highlighted the clear property boundaries, the county surveys, and the questionable references in the legal notice. The mediator listened carefully. At one point, Barbara said, "We also have reason to believe the HOA is acting in concert with outside developers to annex this land for a commercial access route. We will be requesting full disclosure of any communications between the HOA and Brookhawk Investments." Valerie's face visibly tightened at the mention of Brookhawk. She shot her attorney a warning glance, and he cleared his throat awkwardly. "That claim is unsubstantiated," he said, sounding more uncertain than before. "We object to any fishing expedition into the HOA's private dealings." Barbara responded, "If the HOA wants a lawsuit, everything will come under scrutiny. We'll make sure the court compels discovery of all relevant documents." The room felt heavy with tension. Valerie's gaze flickered from me to the mediator. She was cornered, and she knew it. "I propose," Valerie said at last, trying to regain composure, "that Mr. Fletcher remove the fence temporarily while we investigate the boundary dispute. In good faith, the HOA will remove the no-entrance sign as well." There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing. Still, it was the first time she'd shown any willingness to back down. Donovan leaned over and whispered, "She's trying to find a quick exit from this. But we can't let them slip away without accountability." He was right. A short-term compromise might solve the immediate barrier dispute, but it wouldn't expose the deeper corruption. Barbara looked at me, and I shook my head. She turned back to Valerie. "My client declines that offer. We will accept nothing less than a permanent acknowledgement of his property lines, the removal of the no-entrance sign, and a written statement ensuring no future attempts to encroach or reclassify the land. Also, we reserve the right to pursue a full inquiry into any dealings that involve my client's property." Valerie's attorney balked, but the mediator maintained a neutral expression. "We can adjourn for a short recess," the mediator suggested, "to see if the parties can come to an agreement." During the break, we stepped into the hallway. My nerves were on edge, but it felt like we had the upper hand. Steve offered an encouraging nod, and Donovan murmured, "They're rattled. Keep pressing." 10 minutes later, we reconvened. Valerie's attorney tried a final tactic. He offered to drop the threatened fines if I would sign a confidential agreement not to pursue further legal action. Barbara nearly laughed at that suggestion. "Absolutely not," she said. The mediator exhaled, sensing the standoff. "It seems we are at an impasse," she concluded. "This will move toward formal litigation unless there's a sudden change of heart." Valerie shot me a venomous look, then gathered her papers, leaving the room in silence. Once we were out of the courthouse, I leaned against the building's aged stone walls, tension draining from my body. Steve clasped my shoulder in support. Donovan said quietly, "This might get uglier, Fletcher, but you did the right thing not bowing to their hush offer." I nodded, remembering the sign in my yard and the fence I'd built. This was bigger than just a property line. It was about standing up for what was right, about exposing a potential scheme to exploit the neighborhood. If that meant going head-to-head with an entrenched HOA and a shady developer, so be it. As weeks turned into months, the lawsuit hovered like a thundercloud. However, in that time, Barbara succeeded in filing a motion to compel disclosure of communications between Valerie, the HOA board, and Brookhawk. The judge granted it, citing the potential relevance. Under pressure, Brookhawk's legal team produced a series of emails that told the whole story. Valerie had indeed been negotiating with them, promising to secure an expanded easement across multiple properties including mine, in exchange for future consulting fees and improvements to the HOA clubhouse. The language, though careful, clearly indicated a quid pro quo arrangement. When this bombshell emerged, Valerie's attorney scrambled to minimize the fallout, but it was too late. The documents were on record, painting a damning picture of how greed had fueled the HOA's aggression. My fence was only the tip of the iceberg. Once the truth became public, other residents, including Steve, demanded Valerie's immediate resignation. The story spread across our county, with local news outlets reveling in the drama of a small-town HOA embroiled in corruption. Valerie tried to maintain her innocence, claiming she was acting in the best interests of Willow Creek, but no one was buying it anymore. Even the rest of the HOA board distanced themselves from her, confessing they'd been mostly kept in the dark. Within a few weeks, Valerie was voted out of her position. The board quickly dropped the lawsuit against me, acknowledging they had no legal basis. The no-entrance sign disappeared. Someone ripped it out in the dead of night, probably to avoid further embarrassment. My fence remained exactly where it stood, a lasting testament to the standoff. As for Brookhawk, their development project faced heavy scrutiny, and without a compliant HOA president to force expansions, the plan stalled indefinitely. Investigations into possible bribes and unethical conduct continued. Last I heard, Valerie sold her home quietly and moved out of Willow Creek, presumably hoping to start anew somewhere else. In the aftermath, I walked along my fence line, recalling how something as simple as a barrier could represent such a profound stand for personal rights. Steve joined me, letting out a content sigh. "I can't believe how far this went," he said. "But I'm thankful you stuck to your guns." I nodded, my gaze traveling over the fence's strong posts. "I was just protecting what's mine," I replied. "But I guess we protected a lot more than that." In the months that followed, the HOA underwent significant reforms. They replaced Valerie's cronies with more transparent board members who promised to act with genuine fairness. Our neighborhood began to heal from the divisions caused by months of tension. Residents learned a valuable lesson. Collective vigilance was necessary to prevent any individual from wielding unchecked power. Every time I look out at that fence, I'm reminded of a pivotal truth. Sometimes you must push back against those who overreach, even when the fight feels daunting. Because it's in those moments when the deck seems stacked that holding your ground matters the most. Yes, the scars of this battle run deep, but they also taught us that no scheme, no bribe, and certainly no tyrant can prevail if people refuse to be bullied. I still live on my ranch yard, waking each morning to the sight of wide-open fields. The fresh air carries the faintest hint of wood from that fence, and occasionally I catch a smile forming on my lips as I recall Valerie's face when she realized her plan was doomed. My grandfather's voice resonates in my memory, reminding me that justice is not always swift or easy. But if you stand by your principles, document everything meticulously, and never cave to intimidation, you just might topple the mightiest attempts to steal what's rightfully yours. These days, my yard remains free of oppressive signs. The no-entrance edict is history, and that, I believe, is the best ending we could have hoped for. I should mention another moment that lingers in my thoughts, a moment that occurred about a week after Valerie vanished from Willow Creek. My wife and I were sitting on our porch swing, sipping tea at dusk, when a letter arrived from the newly formed interim board. The envelope bore the same HOA logo as before, but the paper inside carried a markedly different tone. It included an apology of sorts, a formal acknowledgement that the association had overstepped by backing Valerie's unilateral decisions. They expressed regret for any emotional distress and legal burdens inflicted upon us, and this was the surprising part. They announced a plan to reimburse homeowners who had been wrongfully fined or forced into unnecessary upgrades. My wife looked at me with a mixture of relief and stunned amusement. "Should we frame this?" she joked. "After all the headaches they caused, this piece of paper represents progress." She had a point. It showed, at least, that the community wanted to correct its path. A few days later, I ran into the newly elected HOA president, a soft-spoken teacher named Sandra Myers, while I was picking up my mail. She hesitated a second, then offered a sincere handshake. "I'm sorry you had to go through all that," she said, genuinely looking me in the eye. "I want you to know we're trying to rebuild trust. Please don't hesitate to let the board know if you have concerns. It was a stark contrast to Valerie's arrogance. I left that exchange feeling hopeful. Sometimes, when a terrible system collapses, good people can rise from the rubble to make things better. Meanwhile, as the months rolled on, rumors spread that Brookhawk Investments had shifted their focus to a different county, presumably to avoid continued scrutiny. I heard whispers that they were under investigation by the state attorney general. That might have been pure speculation, but I relished the notion that their shady tactics were catching up with them. Donovan, the retired official who assisted in unearthing those questionable documents, told me once over coffee that various agencies were now trading information on Brookhawk's history of clandestine deals. He even mentioned that a concerned citizens group in another town had contacted him about questionable zoning changes. The ripple effect was real, and it reminded me how a single stand-like building offense could spark much bigger consequences. Steve, too, found a sense of renewed optimism. He repaired his fence, staining it with a protective coating that preserved the natural wood color, defying the old beige-only directive. Nobody in the HOA complained this time. If anything, Sandra Myers complimented the craftsmanship. Other residents followed suit, repainting or refurbishing their houses in a style that suited their own preferences. It seemed Willow Creek was finally living up to its name, a place of homey comfort rather than an arena of petty power plays. Now, on warm afternoons, Steve and I exchange waves from our respective yards, free from that sense of dread about receiving yet another ultimatum from the association. The entire street feels more relaxed. We see kids playing, dogs running around without fuss, and neighbors chatting over fences. It's a small victory, but an important one. We learn that collective action can topple even the most intimidating figures. Sometimes, as I walk by that sturdy wooden fence marking my property line, I recall a memory from childhood. My grandfather once took me by the hand and led me along the very perimeter we reinforced, pointing out each boundary stake. He said, "Our land, our voice." At 7 years old, I didn't grasp the deeper meaning. I thought he was just showing me the edges of a yard. But now, I understand how property, rights, and dignity intertwine. It's not merely about square footage. It's about the principle of ownership and the freedom to live without tyrannical meddling. This sense of independence is part of the American spirit, something that older generations fought tooth and nail to protect. Every time I think about how Valerie tried to strip that away, I feel a flicker of anger, but it quickly fades into a determination to never let it happen again. I also remember how, in the midst of all this turmoil, my wife stayed calm and supportive, reminding me to keep meticulous records and to maintain composure even when frustration boiled over. She'd hand me a glass of iced tea at the end of a long day and say, "Keep your cool, keep your documents, and keep your sense of humor." That trifecta guided me through every confrontation with Valerie and her minions. The comedic irony of them blocking my yard with a sign labeled "No Entrance" still makes me chuckle. They wanted to push me around by turning my property into an off-limits zone. I retaliated by building a barrier that effectively cut off their precious shortcut. There was satisfaction in using their own tactics against them, but doing so legally and transparently. As for Valerie, I occasionally hear tidbits about her from acquaintances in nearby towns. Rumor has it, she tried to run for a small local council seat somewhere else, but her reputation followed her, and the campaign fizzled out. Some say she ended up working in a company that consults on community planning, but I have no confirmation. While part of me is tempted to track her progress out of curiosity, I'd rather focus on the life my wife and I have rebuilt. We replaced the old battered mailbox with a rustic design, free from the uniformity the HOA once demanded. We've also introduced a small flower garden beside the fence, bursting with colorful perennials that my wife adores. It's a simple pleasureone that might have been nitpicked under Valerie's regime, but now stands as a beautiful symbol of our freedom to choose our own aesthetic. I've kept in touch with Barbara Monroe, my lawyer, although we speak less frequently now. She likes to remind me that this case was a textbook example of how determined homeowners can fend off overreach. She even mentioned wanting to write an article about it, hoping to inspire others in similar battles. I encouraged her, believing wholeheartedly that the more people learn from stories like ours, the less power groups like Brookhawk and individuals like Valerie can wield in the shadows. We may never stamp out corruption entirely, but knowledge is a potent shield. Sometimes, the final images of the confrontation still play in my mind like a movie reel. Valerie storming out of that conference room, her attorney trailing behind, the mediator quietly wrapping up the session. I remember the tension in my chest, the swirl of relief and righteous anger as we emerged onto the courthouse steps. Those moments are etched in my memory not because of how dramatic they were, but because they symbolize a victory built on perseverance rather than brute force. We stood up, we showed our evidence, and we stayed within legal channels. It was messy, stressful, and at times disheartening. Yet it proved that fairness can triumph if you are relentless in pursuing the truth. Today, Willow Creek still has an HOA, but it's an organization that listens rather than dictates. They focus on genuine community improvements, like fixing common walkways or organizing charity events. The ugliness of the past lingers as a cautionary tale, reminding everyone what happens when one individual tries to seize too much influence. Neighbors feel safer voicing their opinions, and the hostility that once darkened our street has evaporated. It's not a perfect world, but it's a far cry from the nerve-wracking tension we endured under Valerie's iron-fisted rule. If I've learned anything, it's that transparency keeps power in check. Indeed, a simple sign declared, "No entrance," but that sign couldn't suppress the truth. People ask me if I regret any of it, if I wish I had just caved to keep the peace. The answer is a resolute no. The conflict tested my patience, my finances, and my sense of security, but it also reaffirmed my beliefs. You defend what's yours, especially when a bully tries to snatch it away. My grandfather's lessons have never felt more relevant. The battles we fight in our local neighborhoods can ripple far beyond property lines, drawing attention to corruption and pushing communities to grow stronger. It's a story as old as time. Ordinary folk standing against unearned power. So here I am, still standing on that porch no intrusive sign in sight, letting the sun warm my face while the gentle wind rustles the leaves. The fence stands firm behind me, a wooden sentinel marking the boundary that no unscrupulous official or developer can cross. It reminds me that, sometimes, you just need to put a little backbone into fighting for your rights. And in the end, that simple conviction can topple the mightiest walls of deceit, so long as you have the resolve to say, enough is enough. When neighbors pass by, they see an ordinary fence, but I see the courage and unity it represents. Maybe that's what Willow Creek needed all along, a reminder that community is built not on fear, but on mutual respect and openness. My ranch yard remains my own, free from those who once tried to claim it. And if anyone, anywhere, doubts the power of standing your ground, well, they only have to look at this fence to see that integrity and perseverance can triumph, even against the most formidable foes. In the weeks after the court ruling, our lives settled into a comfortable rhythm, yet the lessons lingered. I found myself walking the perimeter of the ranch each morning, not out of suspicion, but as a simple ritual of gratitude. The fence, once a symbol of resistance, had become part of the landscape. Sturdy posts, polished wood grain, and wildflowers spilling over its base. Neighbors stopped by more often now. They'd share stories about their own skirmishes with HOA guidelines, laugh about the days when beige paint dictated our wardrobes, and express relief that a new, transparent board replaced Valerie's reign. Those conversations reminded me that what we defended wasn't just property lines, but a shared sense of dignity. One afternoon, as I trimmed the hedge beside the fence, my daughter, now 11, walked up, clutching a sketchbook. "Daddy," she said, "I drew our yard with no fences telling us what to do." I smiled and ruffled her hair. Seeing our home through her eyes underscored how future generations inherit more than land, they inherit the values we fought to protect. I pointed to the fence and told her, "This is where people said, 'Really, you can't build that.' But now, it stands because we stood our ground." She beamed, flipping through her sketches of happy neighbors and free-roaming dogs. In hindsight, the true victory wasn't forcing Valerie out or halting Brookhawk's plans. It was reclaiming the idea that community thrives on mutual respect rather than fear. When I pass by my study at dusk, I often stop to read the old memos, survey notes, and court filings, artifacts of a battle that tested friendships and convictions. They remind me to remain vigilant. Power can become corrupt if left unchecked. As summer wanes, I'm already planning a small reunion barbecue by the fence, inviting everyone who endured Valerie's edicts. We'll grill burgers, share stories, and toast to a neighborhood no longer defined by no entrance signs, but by open gates, open hearts, and the unspoken promise that if anyone ever tries to bully us again, we'll stand together just as firmly as these fence posts.